Welcome to yet another episode of Business and Politics. Today I'm joined by CC's chairman, Marek Matraszek, to discuss Sunday's presidential election. This morning, the State Electoral Commission just announced that President Duda received 43.5%. He was followed by Rafał Trzaskowski with 30.46%. It's now clear that the second round of election will take place on 12th of July, and both Duda and Trzaskowski will compete for the votes of Poles. Marek, should President Duda and Rafał Trzaskowski be satisfied with the results so far?
Well, I think each in their own way, of course. I mean, obviously get into the second round is a big achievement for Rafał Trzaskowski. Remember that when he came in originally, it was as a result of the change in the candidate that the Civic coalition was putting forward. Originally it was Małgorzata Kidawa-Błońska. Due to the COVID epidemic and the change in the electoral law, it became possible to change out their candidate, and she was doing very badly. And that result, the 30.5% I believe that Trzaskowski received, is really a very big boost for him. He managed to revive the Civic platform, Civic coalition campaign. He's got the vote back to what you might say is the historic sort of norm for the Civic coalition. And he's really put a lot of energy into his electoral base and of course the activists who are out there campaigning. So that's very important for him. So that's a very important first step for Trzaskowski. As for President Duda, I think every electoral expert was saying before the election that for him to have a real chance of winning in the second round, he had to be hitting about 44% of the vote. He's got there. Interestingly, actually, because of the very large turnout that you refer to, which I think is it's the third highest turnout there's ever been in any sort of election or referendum ever in Poland, he actually increased the number of votes in comparison with the Law and Justice vote in the parliamentary elections, which itself was a historic high in the autumn of last year. I remember in the first round of the 2015 election, Duda only got about 5.5 million votes. He's already above, I think, 8 million now. So that shows the scale of the progress that he and Law and Justice have been making over the last 5 years. So both men coming into the second round, I think, with a very strong base of support, very mobilized base of support. And of course, the next step is going to be the difficult bit, getting over that 50%.
Yeah. In terms of progress, Szymon Hołownia, the independent candidate, 13.87%. It's an impressive result.
Well, relatively for him, and of course now, remember that Hołownia ran a campaign of essentially being a new force for the centre ground in Polish politics. He was equally critical of both Law and Justice and Civic platform. And the real question for Hołownia now is, what does he do? I mean, there are a couple of schools of thought here. I mean, some people say that actually it is actually in his interest for Mr. Trzaskowski not to win the presidency, because in those circumstances he can legitimately say that he is the inheritor of the anti-law and justice faction of Polish politics, and that he should have been the candidate to beat Duda, and actually to play off the sort of decline, the potential decline in support for the Civic platform that would come if Trzaskowski were to lose. This week we're going to see some intense negotiations between Hołownia and Trzaskowski. Hołownia has to be very careful because his grand ambition is to create a political movement that will actually run in the parliamentary elections in 2023. So he has to really distinguish himself from both Law and Justice and the Civic coalition, and doing a deal right now with Trzaskowski puts him too much into the Civic platform camp. So he needs to be balanced between furthering his own immediate political interests as well as the long-term strategy of building up an alternative centre ground force for the 23 elections.
Back in May, many commentators believed Kosiniak-Kamysz could potentially become a new leader of the opposition. He definitely underperformed 2.36% in the election, and similarly Robert Biedroń, who not so long ago was as well considered a leader of the opposition.
Yeah, these results are actually disastrous for both the Polish People's Party, led by Mr. Kosiniak-Kamysz, and the left, of which Mr. Biedroń was the presidential candidate. Between them, they lost 3 million votes that back in the autumn of last year had gone to votes for PSL and the left, the SLD. That's a disaster for their parties. And really they were victims of the squeeze that resulted from a very polarized vote between Duda and Trzaskowski. Trzaskowski in particular drawing many of the former supporters of the SLD and Biedroń, and Hołownia to some extent in the centre there, taking up some of that substantial amount of those former votes of the PSL. The big question is going to be how far this dramatically awful result for both men results in a permanent damage to the electoral base of the PSL and the SLD, the left, and whether this allows Mr. Hołownia to take up that centrist, centre-leftist vote. So it's a big blow, and of course there will be questions raised about the leadership of the PSL party, and I think also for the SLD, the left. It's a big challenge as to what their future message is going to be. Is it going to continue to be this rather metropolitan, elitist, extreme liberal position that Biedroń held, or will they shift into a more sort of fundamentalist leftist position with perhaps Mr. Zandberg coming up as a future face of that movement? We'll see. But for no question, it really is a very dramatic moment for both the PSL and the SLD.
So we now have just under 2 weeks of intensive campaign between President Duda and Rafał Trzaskowski. But what should we expect after the second round of the election? What are the scenarios?
Well, I think this is a very good question, because for both Trzaskowski and Duda, this is make or break, not just for themselves, but also for their movements and their parties. Obviously, if President Duda were to lose the election, then that would create a huge crisis, a political crisis in Poland. They would raise question marks over the coherence of the Law and Justice Alliance with its sort of various satellite parties that it has, the party of Mr. Gowin and also the party of Mr. Ziobro. There will be questions raised about the viability of the Morawiecki government, which would be facing both a Senate and a presidency controlled by the opposition. And Mr. Kaczynski, the leader of Law and Justice, would have a lot of questions about whether he may want to actually engineer parliamentary elections in order to break the deadlock. And similarly, a loss for Mr. Trzaskowski, I think, would have a dramatic impact on the long-term perception of the viability of the Civic coalition to actually win any election in Poland against Law and Justice. I think this would be the 7th or 8th election that they would have lost. And bear in mind, they actually ran 2 candidates in this election, Mrs. Kidawa-Błońska and now Mr. Trzaskowski. If both fail against Law and Justice, that will create a lot of question marks about the long-term viability. It will cause a boost to Mr. Hołownia, who will want to come up and replace the Civic platform as the main engine of opposition to Law and Justice. So for both men, losing is bad news. Winning, conversely, of course, is very good news. Duda, that consolidates Law and Justice. It calms matters in the Law and Justice party, allows the government of Mr. Morawiecki to continue pretty much in situ for the next 3 years. And for Mr. Trzaskowski, a victory would actually embolden the Civic platform to move forward with confidence to the 2023 parliamentary elections. So this really is a moment in Polish politics where the consequences of victory or failure for either Duda or Trzaskowski will be very significant indeed.
Marek, thank you very much for your comments and your insights.
Pleasure.
And thank you everyone for watching. We'll be back on the 13th of July with a special webinar which will cover the second round of the presidential election in Poland. We'll be sending out invitations. Please register. We hope you join us.